Hello.
Hello.
Welcome back to Brainworms.
Welcome back to Brainworms.
This is episode 3. We made it to the big 3.
Woo!
How are you, Joe?
We live together.
Yeah, I can still inquire.
I'm doing well. I'm excited to tell you about my topic.
Excellent. I am also excited to tell you about my topic. Also, one of the podcast mascots has decided to grace us with her presence, and she's here on my lap.
Kitty, what do you have to say about this? Good point.
Yeah, just as I suspected. Anyway, let's get right into it. All right, Joe, you're up first.
Okay, so my topic today is the prehistory of Dungeons and Dragons.
Ooh.
So I feel like a lot of people know at least a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons due to the recent spike in popularity due to like Stranger Things and Critical Role and Dimension 20. But I wanted to talk about the origins of the game.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I don't really know a lot about the origins of the game. I have played, of course. It's really fun. As a side note, not that anybody asked, but I do feel obligated to say that all of my characters are druids.
That's true.
That's what resonates with me.
And all of my characters are the DM.
The DM.
So,
and you're a really good DM.
thank you. So yeah, I was curious about like, you know, the thing you always hear about D&D is that Gary Gygax made it up in the 70s and, you know, you go from there. What was he influenced by? What were those things influenced by? That's what I'm going to talk about today. When trying to track down the origin of tabletop role-playing games, because that's what D&D is, a tabletop role-playing game, I ended up going back to a game called Chaturanga, which you've told me that this is a word that is used in yoga.
Yes. So when you asked the other day, when we were putting together notes, you told me you were like pronouncing it. How did you pronounce it just now?
Chaturanga?
Yeah. And I was like, are you saying chaturanga? Because that's how I know it. I know it to be a yoga pose.
Pronounced by a white lady, presumably.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I've never taken a yoga class that was not taught by a white lady, which is terrible.
This is also the name of a board game from India from around the 7th century. That's when they say this game popped up. This game is also speculated to be the origin of a bunch of different board games around the world. There's one in China called Changxi, I think, and also Janggi in Korea, Shogi in Japan, Situyin, Burmese game, Makruk in Thailand, and then Ok Chaturang, Cambodian game, and chess. So if you look at a picture of this game, it looks like chess. It looks very similar to chess. At least the setup of like the board and how it's like checkered, and then there's pieces lined up. So it looks very similar to chess, and it indeed is the origin of chess. The modern rules of chess emerged in Europe at the end of the 15th century, and the modern rules that we accept today, that we know and play, were standardized and accepted. So chess is a game that is obviously, on some level, an attempt to abstractly represent war. It's a game that, you know, there's a king and a queen, and there's a bunch of people serving those king and queen and trying to defend them, and you're, you know, in war against another kingdom, supposedly. So there's a thing called war games, which are essentially a response to this, like, non-realism of chess, where, like, you actually want to try to represent war in some kind of realistic way, either for fun or for training. Like, actual militaries, you know, sometimes use war games as, like, a way of training, like, strategy and stuff. So war games are actually the thing that people will tell you immediately if you ask, like, what came before D&D? What was it inspired by? So, for example, there's a game that I'm going to call Hellwig's Game because it was invented by actually a mathematician named Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig. So this is 1780, approximately. He invented this game that is pretty obviously directly inspired by chess. It's a bigger board, more squares, but they're still squares. And now the squares like literally represent terrain. And there's also more pieces. So it actually does use chess pieces, but then there's also additional pieces added to it. The goal, instead of trying to capture the king of the enemy, is to occupy the enemy's fortress. And later versions of the game, he actually got rid of the chess pieces entirely and made up new pieces. Fast forward to 1811, in Prussia, there was a nobleman and a wargaming enthusiast named George Leopold von Reiswitz. So he knew about Hellwig's Game, and he wanted to make it more realistic because this still had squares. It still had rules that were very rigidly controlled. It wasn't very accurate. It didn't represent real warfare very much. He started working on a new game called Kriegspiel, and this literally is German, translates to war games. So in this one, instead of the units moving in a way that's very rigidly like controlled by the rules, they can basically move in a freeform manner.
Is it still set up like a grid?
No. So the grid is gone because the grid was there essentially to like make the movements rigid.
I see.
Right? Like you could move in this exact way. The same way in chess. Like it's all about how many squares can you move in what shape. So his first prototype for this game was a table that he covered in damp sand. And he used this sand to essentially mold the terrain that the game was going to happen on. And so he was able to make like little hills and valleys and more accurately represent terrain that might, affect the battlefield. And he had like little wooden blocks to represent troop formations. And so this part's important. In these early war games, it's all about, you're an officer and you are commanding troops to move. And you don't command a single troop to move. You command like a little squadron, a little formation of troops, right? So each individual piece is a bunch of troops. So this nobleman Reiswitz developed this game to try to more accurately represent war. But actually, the Prussian princes heard about it. Word got around, and he showed it to them, and they were so impressed that they told their dad, the king. So King Frederick Wilhelm III of Prussia. In 1812, he built a much fancier version of the game. So the first one, it was sand on a table, right? Now, way upgraded. It's a wooden table/cabinet. The drawers are all filled with materials to play the game. It's all built into the drawers. There's a board that folds out and becomes the surface to play on. And when it folds all the way out, it's 6 feet by 6 feet. So it's pretty big. And then all of the pieces that go on the board, so both terrain and the units, are made out of porcelain.
Fancy.
Yeah, it was very fancy. It was very expensive to make. It was, commissioned by the king, so that was okay. He gave him the money. But it was so expensive that it was not at all adopted by army instructors as a training tool, and it was not sold commercially. So eventually, Reiswitz loses interest in developing his game, but his son actually also becomes an officer in the military and eventually takes up the task of developing the game. One of the things that he adds to the game is that your units could potentially suffer an attack but not be eliminated from the attack, right? So it's possible that you have a troop that is attacked but survives the attack even though they are injured by it. Some troops could even be attacked multiple times before they have to be removed from the field entirely. So this is actually the first instance of hit points being introduced into these war games. Instead of a troop just like getting hit and removed, there's actual reduction of points over time. And relatedly, there's also variable damage. There's, different types of attacks, and different types of units can have different levels of damage that they're inflicting. And this is partly determined by using dice. So this is also one place where we see dice being introduced into war games. Another major innovation that Rice Whites Jr. introduced to these games is the introduction of an umpire. So this is a person who, is not participating in the game in the sense of, this side or that side, but instead is watching the game and determines the outcomes of certain scenarios that happen that are not covered by the rules. So there's a bunch of rules for, if you roll this on the die, then then this is the outcome of the scenario. But it's easy to imagine that there just come scenarios where it's more complicated than that. Another interesting thing about the umpire is that previously in war games, the players would move their troops, and now the umpire, they actually have to tell their intentions, their commands that they're giving to the troops to the umpire. And then after the umpire has collected all the information for this turn, then he would decide what actually happens. And this is supposed to simulate, the officer giving orders, but what the troops actually do is not necessarily literally what the commander instructed. Another element that was added was basically fog of war. So if from lots of video games, fog of war is just accounting for the fact that you're not going to have a complete map of the scenario of whatever place that you're in because you haven't seen it yet. Especially in a war scenario, you don't know where your enemy's troops are, right? So in a regular war game, you could just look and see what your enemy was doing. Now that's eliminated by having these removable terrain pieces. And so at the start of the game, you only have the terrain pieces set out that you could see, and the new ones are introduced as soon as they come into line of sight of your troops. So in 1824, the prince invited Rice Whites Jr. to present his new improved version of Kriegspiel to the king, and the king was very impressed and officially endorsed this game as a training tool for the officer corps. So the king ordered that every regiment was going to receive a Kriegspiel set, and Rice Whites set up a workshop so that he could mass produce these and distribute them. This was the first war game that was widely adopted by a military as a serious tool for training. So in 1873, a lieutenant named Wilhelm Jacob Meckel published 2 treatises, so one in that year and then another one a few years later, basically saying, Kriegspiel's great, but it has some issues. The broad overview of all the issues is basically the rules are too complicated, right? So he says the rules constrain the umpire. So these are war games, right? And this is training for war. And the umpire is often an experienced officer, trying to train younger officers, meaning that he's supposed to be bringing in his expertise to the scenario to make up what he thinks would happen in these scenarios, but the rules dictate, in some sense, what is happening most of the time. So that's constraining the umpire from using his experience. Also, the rules are too rigid to realistically model all possible scenarios that could occur in war. And the computations that you have to do with rolling the dice and figuring out how much damage things do is complicated, and it slows the game down. This, by the way, resonates a lot because it sort of still happens in D&D.
Yes. Sometimes battle takes a little bit too long.
The battle can take as long as it needs to, as long as it's fun. But what sucks is when it's slowed down specifically by the boring parts.
Because you're right. As long as it's fun, it's not a big deal. I think it's the mechanics of it all, I guess.
Yeah. And you want some mechanics, because otherwise you're just, you're
and
just
I go up to him and I hit him.
And he dodges. Nice try. His last complaint is that there are too few officers who actually are willing to learn all of the rules. And again, this is kind of still an issue with D&D, where finding a player who's willing to become a DM and run the game, it can be hard. If you're the DM, there's this idea of a perpetual DM, because it's hard to get your players to switch the roles with you sometimes. So he wrote these treatises saying that he thinks the rules are overcomplicated, and basically proposed replacing the rule system with just leaving it up to the umpire. The whole point of this is that this is a training tool for higher level officers to train lower level officers in the army. So why don't we just use their expertise as a replacement for the rules? That'll make it easier for them to pick the game up. It'll make it more realistic based on these people's experience actually being in war, and it just makes everything quicker and easier. And so this is called the Free Kriegspiel movement. So let's jump forward in time again. So in 1880, Charles Totten started developing his own war game, heavily influenced by Kriegspiel, for the U.S. Army. And this game that he developed, I'm going to pronounce it Strategos. It's spelled exactly like the board game Stratego, but with an S at the end. And I couldn't find a pronunciation, so I'm going to call it Strategos. So in Strategos, he basically splits the game into two different games. There's two different sub-games. There's the battle game and then the advanced game. So the battle game is essentially the same as Hellwig's game. So there's a board, there's some pieces, you move them around. This is the simulation for the war. And then the advanced game had a lot more to it, as you could imagine with the name. It had maps, and it had little miniature terrain pieces. He would draw out different maps. He drew out the map for himself as the umpire, would have a map that had all of the information for the whole board. And then he would draw separate maps for the two sides, so that they would just have access to the information that they would realistically have in these scenarios, the position of their troops and whatnot. They would roll dice in the middle of the table, whereas, in previous games, all the rolling was done by the umpire in secret. So doing all the calculations in the background and then just relaying the results. So this is the first time that the dice are being rolled out in the open. So that's where I'm going to stop talking about old war games from the 1800s and fast forward to the 1960s. For the audience's sake, I'll let them know that you wiggled your head rhythmically and put up a peace sign.
Groovy, baby.
Setting the scene, it's 1967. We're in the Midwest, in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, and a student, David Wesley, is in the library and finds an old copy of Strategos. After reading this and enjoying it very much, he was a member of something called the Midwest Military Simulation Association. So these are wargaming enthusiasts, and so this was right up his alley. He found an old war game, and he loved it. Nerd, big time. I mean, I couldn't help but think of all those people from the 1800s and the 1700s, as just giant dorks.
Tape on their glasses.
The stereotype of D&D players, but just set in the 1800s. So then Wesley starts developing expansions of Strategos. So he developed something called Strategos N being for Napoleonic Wars, and Strategos C for the Civil War. So in 1969, so the next year after he's developed these, he's playing them. He's setting up a game in the Napoleonic setting, and he makes up a fictional town called Braunstein. In this game that he's setting up, there's multiple players and there's multiple objectives. It's a complicated game, and importantly, he's assigning individual roles for each player, right? So no longer are we talking about just having two sides and having them be officers in this army, on these two armies, and controlling masses of troops. Now people are starting to have individual roles in the setting, including non-military roles. So, for example, he had players that were the mayor, the banker, the university chancellor. He set up this game, and a ton of people show up. So 20 people show up to play this game. He was not prepared for that, but he handled it well. He started making up more roles for people to fill.
As a DM, does that sound like your worst nightmare?
That does sound like my worst nightmare. I early on in my DMing, I had a policy of the more the merrier, until one time we were planning for a game of like 5 or 6, and people brought friends and people brought friends, and
it wasn't that many people.
In my mind, it was 20 people showed up to my game of 5. And that's when I realized this is unmanageable. At least within, modern day 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Something he did not expect to happen was that the players started to use their characters to talk to one another. This was not how the game was set up to be played. It was supposed to be that they would go into a separate room with the referee and then come back out, and that's how information was conveyed between the players and the referee in secret. But they were just talking in character. So I'm reading this as the introduction of role play into these war games. Another thing that happened during this particular game is that 2 players unexpectedly challenged each other to a duel. This was not in the rules. This is not how the game was set up to be played. But Wesley improvised rules for the encounter on the spot. So Wesley was really disappointed by this game. He thought that it was way too chaotic and it was a failed experiment. But the players in the game loved it and asked him to play more. So this is basically the invention of the game Bronstein. So that's the name of the game, is this fictional town that it all took place in. So a few years before this, so also in 1967, the same year that Wesley came across Strategos, another game was published in that year. So this is called Siege of Badenburg. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about Siege of Badenburg, except that it was a war game which is specifically set in medieval times. So all the ones that I had been saying up until this point, it was either just set up to be played in contemporary time, or it was like the Napoleonic Wars and the Civil War, right? This one is specifically medieval. So a guy named Jeff Perrin found this game and started making his own modifications to it. And he brought it to his friend Gary Gygax. Both Jeff and Gygax were members of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association. This is another wargaming hobby group. So Gygax took Jeff's modifications and edited and expanded these. So eventually they turned this into their own game called Chainmail. So Chainmail is a game set in medieval times and using miniatures for wargaming. But it also came with a fantasy supplement. So this is the first time in my story where fantasy as a setting is being utilized in these war games. So this is really where it's starting to transform, obviously, into D&D. So in 1971, they published this game, Chainmail, and this fantasy supplement comes along with, information about having characters play as a hero, a superhero, or a wizard, right? So this is the beginnings of like the D&D classes there was also enemies that were elves, orcs, and dragons. So obviously they were also influenced in using stuff from Lord of the Rings, right? So the classic fantasy series. So also in the late 60s, there's another wargaming hobbyist group that is called the Twin Cities Military Miniatures Group. So one of the members of this group was David Wesley. Remember, he was the one who invented Bronstein. So one of the players in his Bronstein games is a guy named Dave Arneson. So while playing in Wesley's Bronstein games, Arneson begins to develop his own rules, his own game around the idea of having one-on-one type interactions and having non-combat objectives built into the game. So eventually, Wesley has to leave the hobbying group, and this is when Arneson really takes off and develops his own modification of Bronstein, in which the players play fantasy versions of themselves in a setting that he made up himself called the Barony of Blackmoor. He also is aware at this time of the chainmail system developed by Gygax and Jeff Perrin, and incorporates this into his games. In 1972, Arneson travels to Lake Geneva to meet with Gary Gygax, and that he runs a game of Blackmoor for Gary and some of his friends. Gary loves it, and he takes this and he starts his own campaign, largely running the same style as Arneson's Blackmoor game, and he calls this Greyhawk. So people who know a lot about, early D&D know that Blackmoor and Greyhawk are two of the main settings that you could play D&D in the old days. So in 1973, Gygax and Arneson start to collaborate by phone and by mail, right? So they don't live near each other, but they love each other's ideas about these games, right? Gary starts to really get the feeling that they're on the verge of something really good, right? They're both developing these games, and he really thinks that this one is going to be good, and that other people are sort of on the same track. There's other people who are also developing these like medieval fantasy modifications of war games. And so he pushes to put this out quickly. In order to help do this, he starts a company called Tactical Studies Rules, TSR. So this company, TSR, is the original owner of Dungeons and Dragons. So they start trying to find people who will invest and publish this game. They started their company, but that doesn't mean that they have the money to publish this themselves. And so they were rejected by several of the companies that would produce this normally, and eventually they are able to get $2,000 from a guy named Brian Bloom. And they use this $2,000 and $100 of that for the artwork to produce this game, right? And so they are able to do it. They publish a 3-book set, and this game is Dungeons and Dragons. So this is it. Arneson and Gygax have written Dungeons and Dragons, and they are able to publish it in 1973. The production itself is very cheap. It's very amateurish looking, but they do it. It's really popular. So they were able to produce 1,000 copies, and it sells out. I think I saw somewhere it said in 10 months they were able to sell 1,000 copies. So pretty good. And in 1975 they put out the Greyhawk and Blackmoor supplemental settings. In 1977 they expand and put it out as 2 different games. There's the D&D Basic Set, which is a simplified version of the game, and then Advanced D&D is obviously a more advanced one that has a lot more complicated rules. It's after this point, after they established AD&D, They put out the first monster manual in 1977, the first player's handbook in 1978 with 6 adventure modules also. And then in 1979, they put out the first Dungeon Master's Guide. So that's how Dungeons and Dragons came to be. This is where historically we see war simulation and games around imagining war scenarios, how it evolved into what we now play as Dungeons and Dragons.
I don't think that I really thought that D&D was like so war related, but as you were sort of like laying everything out, I was like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. There is a big part of the game that has to do with battle and attacking and all of that. And I could see how its origin sort of like made it the kind of game that it is now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I had always heard that war games were sort of the inspiration for Gary Gygax and all those guys to invent Dungeons and Dragons. But I didn't know like exactly where they came from. I didn't know what they were really like. And it's true what you're saying, that like Dungeons and Dragons is in some sense primarily a war game. It is a game of battle. There's like they say there's like 3 pillars of play. There's combat, exploration, and social interactions, or role playing. And the real truth of it is that the rules are, for the most part, about battle. The role playing is freeform. It's just whatever you want to do. And I think that freeformness, you can see that coming from that like free Kriegspiel thing. Like in essence, in philosophy, it's coming from that, where they're saying like we want to bring in our own experience and our own interpretation of these things. We don't want like rigid rules dictating certain aspects of it.
Thank you for illuminating us about the prehistory of D&D.
Yeah, and maybe in a future episode, I'll tell you more about the way that TTRPGs have evolved since D&D was introduced.
I think that would be awesome.
So, what is your topic today?
All right, today I'm going to talk about something Disneyland related. This topic was inspired by the recent announcement that the Monsters, Inc. ride at Disney California Adventure is going to go away next year. I was talking about it with some friends last weekend, and then I remembered that I'd seen a video a little bit ago from the YouTube channel Defunctland that talked about the ride that was there before Monsters, Inc. So this ride is called Superstar Limo, and it's going to be my topic for today. So Superstar Limo is actually considered to be Disney's worst ride by a lot of people. Just because Disneyland is the happiest place on earth, it doesn't mean that they always get everything right. So,
right. It takes trial and error to become the happiest place on earth, I guess.
That's true. At one point, it was just a place on earth. And they've been working at it. In February of 2001, Disney opens Disney California Adventure in Anaheim, California, just across from the original Disneyland park. This came after a few failed attempts at opening other theme parks in Southern California. One of them being Westcott, which was supposed to be like the West Coast Epcot.
Oh, I see.
And the other being Port Disney, which was going to be at the Queen Mary in Long Beach. Obviously, there's a lot of lore behind why these two didn't work out, which I thought might be fun to cover in a different episode. So I won't get too much into them today, but I just wanted to mention that Disney had been trying for a while, and eventually in 2001, they opened Disney California Adventure. So one of the signature rides in this brand new shiny theme park was Superstar Limo. It was in the Hollywood section of the park, so it sort of fit the theme. It was about celebrities and all of that. However, The version that opened in 2001 was not the one that Michael Eisner, the CEO at the time, and the Disney Imagineers had cooked up initially. So this is where we go back to the original concept for Superstar Limo, like the ride that it was supposed to be. So originally, Superstar Limo was a dark, high-speed ride that would take guests on a wild paparazzi chase through Hollywood. As guests boarded the ride, they would be greeted by Michael Eisner, and he would let them know that they needed to get over to Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, which is very popular for being, the one that has celebrities' handprints in the front and all of that. It's like a Hollywood landmark. Eisner would be in like the on-ride video, letting the guests know that, you need to get over there. It's your movie premiere, and also would warn guests that the paparazzi were chasing after them, and if they were caught doing anything bad or anything unsavory, that they would have to cancel their contract. So the stakes were high in this original game. It was all about, being a celebrity in Hollywood and being chased around by the paparazzi. So not only was the ride supposed to be like a high-speed chase, but it also included a lot of like goofy jokes and gags that were supposed to make a reference to being a celebrity in Hollywood. And at the end, Michael Eisner would tell the guests that he needed to cancel their contract, and they would take like a tabloid-like photo at the end of the ride of, the people on the ride.
So you're telling me that the original plan for this ride was that you were destined to fail?
Yep, basically.
And get your contract removed and get fired and...
I mean, honestly, a pretty realistic portrayal of Hollywood for some. Like you
the
start
average
out...
experience.
Huh?
Yeah, the average experience of people who are trying to make it big in Hollywood.
Yeah.
For the most part, do not get the contract.
No, they try their best, and then they get caught up in some drama, and the tabloids talk about them, and then they're like, sorry, no contract for you. With this ride and with Disney California Adventure, Disney was trying something new. Like they were very much trying to find their footing in this setting. It wasn't super like classic character centric. It was more about, the setting. Like one of the main reasons that they cited for even considering a park like Disney California Adventure is that people would come to Disneyland and it wasn't more than like a one-day activity. And even though people were staying at Disneyland Resort, they were then venturing off site and exploring all the other wonderful things that California had to offer. And so their whole like mentality behind it was like, what if we, sort of create this like little mini version of California within our parks so that we can then get people to spend more than one day here. Like come to Disneyland, come to Disney California Adventure, and stick around. So it was a pretty big deviation from what they were doing at Disneyland. It was like a little bit of a risk. So I did mention that this was the original concept for the ride. So you may be wondering, why did the ride change? So the reinvention of Superstar Limo actually has a little bit of a dark backstory. So as many people know, as is a historic fact, in August of 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a limo accident where her driver was fleeing from paparazzi and lost control of the wheel. This, of course, was a really devastating event. Princess Diana was so well liked that, everyone around the world, of course, was like grieving her. Unfortunately for Disney, for Michael Eisner, and for the Imagineers who created this concept for Superstar Limo, obviously this meant that they might need to go back to the drawing board, given that a lot of the elements in the original version of Superstar Limo were exactly what happened with Princess Diana, and it would be terribly insensitive to leave the ride as is and open the park with this ride that sort of like resembles something that happened in real life. So now Michael Eisner and the Disney Imagineers have this, probably at this point, like half-built ride. And in order to keep it, they had to obviously change it up. So after reevaluating, they decided to change these three aspects of the ride. The ride could no longer be a high-speed chase for obvious reasons. They also needed to remove anything paparazzi related within the ride. And they also decided that it would be kind of like more fun, I guess, if they added a few more gags throughout about Hollywood and like Hollywood specific stuff. So the Imagineers who developed the updated version with, all of these changes weren't really happy with the outcome. If anything, I would imagine that they thought that it wasn't good enough and maybe they would just scrap the ride. But Michael Eisner was all about it. He was like, hell yeah, this sounds great. Let's move forward. Like he greenlit all of their updates and said, let's just go ahead and make Superstar Limo so that it can be a ride when the park opens. Carrying on with this new version of the ride meant scrapping and repurposing parts from the previous ride. Also, budgets were really being slashed, so they ended up having to change the plan for the exterior as well, and they ended up going with a more kind of like cartoon cutout look, which they ended up incorporating inside of the ride too. Once the Imagineers have made all these changes, at some point Eisner realized that the ride wasn't going to be very good. And he actually asked the Imagineers to remove him from the ride, because you know how he was supposed to be like the person who introed the ride, like the on-ride video had Michael Eisner in it. And once he realized the ride was going to be kind of a stinker, he was like, yeah, I don't want to be on this anymore. So after he said, take me off the ride, the on-ride footage was replaced with footage of a kind of a creepy puppet guy that was supposed to be like a sleazy Hollywood agent. Basically, in the footage, he told the guests who were on the ride that, it's something similar, just to not be late for the movie premiere, basically. And I also just encourage everyone to, again, go watch that Defunctland video. I will, of course, link it in the description of the podcast, because there's footage of the ride and like everything I'm referencing, you can obviously see for yourself. So after all this rigmarole, after all the changes, the ride did open along with the park in February 8th of 2001. So now let me tell you a little bit about what the ride ended up looking like. So the exterior of the ride featured LA landmarks like Union Station, City Hall, and the Beverly Hills Hotel. It also featured something called Angel's Flight, which was known to be the world's shortest railway and was, I think opened in like the early 1900s and was like a really big LA landmark. Unfortunately, 1 week before Disney California Adventure opened, there was an accident that resulted in a death of a railway passenger. So, they were in a bit of a time crunch. They were going to open the park a week later, so they did not have time to remove that reference to Angel's Flight from the ride, which to me is like, that's a bad omen if there ever was one. Like, somebody died on this attraction and now it's on your ride and you can't even do anything about it. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, that's just bad luck.
Yeah, truly. This whole ride is cursed, and that I feel like that was like further proof. They're about to open and something like this happens is really crazy. So the news story of the attraction placed the rider as Hollywood's newest celebrity. It started out at LAX. The line of the ride was basically you walking through LAX. There was a point when you're in the line where you can see a stack of luggage because you're supposed to be at the airport arriving in LA, and then you get on the limo. Once you're on the limo, it takes you through a variety of locations and sort of like different encounters and situations when you're on your way to Still Grauman's Chinese Theater for your movie premiere. So that part didn't change. So some of the locations featured within the ride included Rodeo Drive, the Sunset Strip, Bel Air, and Malibu. Like I said, the ride was largely made up of this like cutout style, but the only three-dimensional figures within the ride were supposed to represent celebrities. So they're kind of like puppets, but they're not animatronics because their faces don't move. They're just like little figures of certain celebrities. And that was supposed to be like, I guess, like the coolest part of the ride.
So you're saying it was like wax statues like Madame Tussauds? Did it like look like that? Or like were they supposed to be realistic or like cartoony statues?
Cartoony statues.
Okay.
But still like more statue like than animatronic like. They did have some movement, but it wasn't like in their face. It was like they all had like sort of just one motion. Due to the lack of budget, which I had mentioned before, the celebrities in the ride would have to be celebrities whose likenesses were cheap, or it could also be celebrities that already had contracts with Walt Disney Company. So the celebrities in the ride were Regis Philbin, Melanie Griffith, Antonio Banderas, Cindy Crawford, Tim Allen, Jackie Chan, Drew Carey, Cher, and Whoopi Goldberg.
Honestly, I think Jackie Chan and Whoopi Goldberg are the... I guess and Antonio Banderas are like the...
Cher. I feel like they're not by any means like C-list celebrities, but well, maybe Drew Carey. But like they were also probably not the biggest at the time, you know?
Right.
I did want to point out, and you'll see this in the video if you go watch it, the part with Cher is so funny to me because they put her like off in the corner. Like she's kind of in like a dimly lit corner, and the puppet or whatever figure of her looks like really uninterested in being there. Like not even looking over at the people on the ride or anything like that. She looks like she's sulking in the corner. It's really bizarre. All of the other ones in the video you'll see like look, you know, relatively happy, like cheerful. I think at the time Melanie Griffith and Antonio Banderas were married, so like, you know, they set them up like together and kind of hugging and waving or something like that. Yeah, for some reason the Cher one really got me because she looks like she does not want to be there, which is I think probably accurate for Cher. So the very end of the ride, you know, ends with you finally getting to the Chinese theater, and at the end there's a billboard that displays an image captured of the guests on the ride. So now let's get a little bit into the reception of this ride, which I already spoiled and said that this is the worst ride, but in case you haven't put it together, it was not good. Superstar Limo was criticized as lacking and poor in concept in an early review of California Adventure in the Boston Globe, and Chalfant stated, "Kids will also like Superstar Limo in the Hollywood Pictures backlot area. Here you play the star, riding in your purple limo past a few audio animatronic Hollywood celebrities. Adults will notice, however, that other pointed plywood characters and sets are about on par with college theater constructions."
Not college theater catching strays.
Yeah, what did they do? Their sets are probably better, honestly. Similarly, James Sterngold of the New York Times called it probably the schlockiest attraction in the park. An article by David Rorden in the Longview Daily News said the space would be better devoted to something more entertaining, such as an audio animatronic dentist doing root canals on all Imagineers who came up with the idea for Superstar Limo. Not good. Not a good reception. Disney California Adventure as a whole was struggling, and people weren't going. Like, the park was empty. So I did also want to bring up something that was in the Defunctland video. Shortly after the park opened, there was some sort of TV segment that featured celebrities like Rosie O'Donnell, Drew Carey, and a few others going to California Adventure and going on the ride. When they get there, they're like so excited. Of course, Drew Carey's like, "I'm in the ride," whatever, right? And once they're going through the ride, you can tell that they are like very underwhelmed, maybe even a little uncomfortable. At one point, Rosie O'Donnell tells Drew Carey, like, "Let's pretend like we're asleep." And they're like sleeping on the ride. They're cracking jokes. And I think it was meant to like obviously like drum up excitement for this ride. But even the celebrities that were on the ride that were, I'm sure, paid to be there, and Drew Carey, who was on it, still was like, I don't know, this is fucking weird. So after being open for about a year, Superstar Limo closed in January of 2002. So the ride sat empty in the Disney California lot for about 4 years. And in January of 2006, Monsters, Inc., Mike and Sully to the Rescue took the place of Superstar Limo. However, Superstar Limo lives on, in a way. Since the Monsters, Inc. ride opened just a year before the park was set to do really big renovations, there wasn't much of a budget to work with. So the Imagineers decided to use a lot of the Superstar Limo ride when making the new Monsters Inc. ride. There are a few things in the Monsters Inc. ride, which again is closing next year, that were part of Superstar Limo and were just sort of like reskinned to make sense for the new ride. Some of those things are the exterior, like the exterior of the ride still has like the same structure, but of course they painted over it with the doors from Monsters Inc. for it to make sense for this new ride. They also repurposed the limo itself. They turned them into Monstropolis taxi cabs. And then lastly, they reused some of the celebrity figures. And basically, they dressed them up as characters from the movie, specifically the Child Detective Agency guys who were like in head to toe like yellow suits. And so you can't really tell if you don't know because they're just completely covered. But there are a few where if you look side by side, you're like, yeah, that definitely was. I think the Jackie Chan one is the easiest one to spot because he's in a very particular pose, and that you can tell they just put a suit on him and he's still on the ride. If you happen to go to Disney California Adventure before they change the ride, you should definitely look out for those. So that was it. That was my topic. That was all about the worst ride in Disney history, Superstar Limo.
Wow, that was a wild ride. So that was our episode for today.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow us on Instagram. We're at brainworms_pod. We'll see you on the next episode.
Bye.